The morning of March 5th, 1987, dawned grey and humid across the Mississippi Delta, the kind of day where the air hung thick as cotton and promised nothing but hard work under an unforgiving sky. At 4:30 a.m., the first alarm clock rang in the weathered wooden house on Catfish Creek Road, where Samuel Big Sam Washington had lived for 37 years, raising 4 children and watching the land change hands more times than he cared to count. Big Sam rolled out of bed, his joints creaking like the floorboards beneath his feet, and walked to the window that looked out over the endless rows of cotton that stretched toward the horizon. His wife Loretta was already in the kitchen, the smell of bacon grease and coffee filling the small space that had seen countless early mornings just like this one. She handed him his lunch pail without a word, the same metal container his father had carried to the fields 40 years before. They had developed this rhythm over 2 decades of marriage, a quiet efficiency born from understanding that words were luxury when you had to be in the fields before sunrise. Big Sam kissed her forehead and stepped out into the humid darkness, where 17 other men were already gathering near the old red barn that served as their meeting point. The Meridian County Agricultural Collective had been operating for just over 3 years. A cooperative formed when the big agribusiness companies started squeezing out the small farmers who had worked this land for generations. What started as 8 families pooling resources to buy equipment had grown into something larger, a network of nearly 200 families who shared everything from tractors to harvest crews. They had scraped together enough money to purchase a 1982 International Harvester, a massive green machine that could do the work of 20 men in half the time. That tractor represented hope, the possibility that they could compete with the corporate farms that were swallowing up family operations across the Delta. Marcus "Tank" Jefferson supervised the morning crew assignments, his clipboard already damp with humidity as he called out names and field numbers. Tank had earned his nickname in Vietnam, where he served 2 tours before coming home to find his family's farm sold to pay medical bills. At 6'4" and built like the machinery he operated, Tank commanded respect from every man who worked these fields. He assigned Big Sam to the eastern section, where the cotton was coming in thick and would need careful handling. 15 minutes into the workday, as the sun finally crested the tree line, Tank noticed something that made his stomach clench with dread. The International Harvester was gone. Where the massive green tractor had been parked the night before, only oil stains and tire tracks remained in the red clay dirt. Tank walked the perimeter of the barn, looking for signs of forced entry, but the building was secure. Someone with a key had taken their tractor, the machine that represented 3 years of sacrifice and saved pennies from every family in the collective. Tank's hands shook as he pulled out his worn address book and started making phone calls, beginning with Sheriff Deputy Raymond Kellum, who had grown up in these same fields before joining law enforcement. Deputy Kellum arrived 23 minutes later in his patrol car, the blue and white Crown Victoria kicking up dust as it pulled alongside the barn. At 52 years old, Kellum had seen plenty of equipment theft in his 15 years wearing the badge, but this felt different. The collective's tractor wasn't just another piece of machinery, it was the economic lifeline for nearly 200 families. Kellum walked the scene methodically, taking photographs and measurements, noting that whoever took the tractor knew exactly what they were doing. The theft had been clean, professional, and planned. By 7:15 a.m., word had spread through the community phone network that connected every farm family within 20 miles. Loretta Washington called her sister Ruby, who called the Hendersons, who called the Johnsons, and within an hour, every family in the collective knew their tractor was gone. The anger was immediate and fierce. These families had sacrificed everything to buy that machine, skipping meals and working extra jobs to make the monthly payments. Some had mortgaged their homes, others had sold family heirlooms that had been passed down for generations. Tank Jefferson stood in the middle of the barn, surrounded by 17 men whose faces reflected the same mixture of rage and desperation he felt burning in his chest. These weren't just his employees. They were his neighbors, men he had grown up with, men whose children played with his children. Willie Preacher Davis, who got his nickname from the way he could quote scripture while operating any piece of farm equipment, spoke what everyone was thinking. He said they couldn't just wait for the sheriff's department to handle this, that they needed to find that tractor themselves, that their family's survival depended on getting it back before the spring planting season passed them by. The discussion that followed would later be dissected in courtrooms and newspaper articles, analyzed by everyone from criminal psychologists to agricultural economists. But in that moment, it was just 18 desperate men trying to figure out how to save their community. Tank remembered that Eddie Carmichael, who worked at the John Deere dealership in Jackson, had mentioned seeing their tractor on a transport truck heading north on Highway 49 the previous evening. Eddie hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming it was being taken for routine maintenance, but now that information took on crucial importance. By 10:30 a.m., Tank had organized the men into 3 search teams, each taking a different route through the county. Big Sam led the team that headed north toward Yazoo City, following Highway 49, where Eddie had spotted the transport truck. The other teams went west toward Vicksburg and east toward Meridian, spreading out across the delta like spokes on a wheel. They drove in pickup trucks loaded with tools and spare fuel, men who knew every back road and farm lane in 3 counties. At 11:47 a.m., Big Sam's team found the tractor. It was parked behind Coleman Brothers Equipment, a dealership that had been struggling financially for months. The massive green International Harvester sat in the service bay, already partially disassembled, its serial numbers being ground off with industrial tools. 3 men in coveralls were working on the machine, their faces covered with welding masks, completely absorbed in their illegal modification work. Big Sam felt his blood pressure spike as he recognized the voice of Jimmy Coleman, the dealership owner who had tried to buy the collective's equipment contract 6 months earlier. What happened next unfolded in less than 4 minutes, but those 4 minutes would haunt every family involved for the rest of their lives. Tank Jefferson and his 17 men surrounded the service bay, blocking every exit, their voices raised in accusation and demand. Jimmy Coleman emerged from behind the tractor, his hands raised but his face defiant. He claimed he had bought the tractor legitimately from a man named Roberts, had paperwork to prove it, said he was just doing routine maintenance work. The confrontation escalated when Coleman's 2 employees, both white men from town who had never worked a day in the fields, started making comments about property rights and knowing your place. Willie Preacher Davis, the most peaceful man in the collective, the man who had never raised his voice in anger, snapped. He grabbed a wrench from the workbench and took a step toward Coleman, his voice shaking as he demanded to know how much they had paid for stolen dreams. Tank Jefferson would later testify that he tried to calm everyone down, tried to get his men to back away and let the law handle the situation. But 37 years of accumulated frustration, of watching their community slowly strangled by economic forces beyond their control, had created a powder keg that finally found its spark. When Coleman reached for the telephone to call the sheriff, claiming he was the victim of an armed robbery, something inside these 18 men broke. The violence that followed lasted less than 90 seconds, but it would define the rest of their lives and become a cautionary tale told in courtrooms across the South for decades to come. It began when Coleman's employee, a 24-year-old named Preston Burke, pulled a pistol from his toolbox and pointed it at Tank Jefferson's chest. Burke later claimed he fired in self-defense, but the bullet went wide and shattered a hydraulic line, sending pressurized fluids spraying across the service bay. Big Sam Washington, the gentle giant who had never been in a fight in his adult life, saw that gun, and thought about his 3 children at home, about his wife Loretta waiting for him to come back safe. He charged Burke with a fury that surprised everyone, including himself, tackling the younger man to the concrete floor. The gun skittered across the bay, disappearing under a pile of machinery parts. What followed was chaos. 18 angry men in a confined space, years of economic desperation, finally finding an outlet in physical violence. Tank Jefferson tried to restore order, shouting for his men to back down, but his voice was lost in the mayhem. Coleman and his 2 employees were overwhelmed immediately, 3 men against 18, but they fought with the desperate strength of people who knew their lives were in danger. Preston Burke managed to break free from Big Sam and ran for the office, where another telephone waited. Willie Preacher Davis caught him at the doorway, and the 2 men went down in a tangle of arms and legs. At 12:03 p.m., a single gunshot echoed across Coleman Brothers' equipment. Preston Burke had managed to reach a second weapon, a hunting rifle that Coleman kept in the office for security. In the struggle with Willie Davis, the rifle discharged, the bullet striking Davis in the chest at point-blank range. The gentleman who quoted scripture while operating farm machinery collapsed on the office floor, blood spreading across his work shirt, his eyes wide with shock and pain. The sight of their friend and neighbor bleeding out on the concrete floor transformed the 18 men from angry farmers into something much more dangerous. What followed would later be described by prosecutors as a massacre, by defense attorneys as a tragic accident, and by the families involved as the inevitable result of a system that had pushed desperate people beyond their breaking point. Tank Jefferson knelt beside Willie Davis, trying to stop the bleeding with his bare hands, while the other 16 men surrounded Coleman and Burke with a fury that had moved beyond rational thought. Jimmy Coleman died at 12:07 p.m. from blunt force trauma to the head, struck repeatedly with the same tools he had been using to remove serial numbers from their stolen tractor. Preston Burke lasted until 12:11 p.m., when multiple injuries and shock finally overwhelmed his body's ability to keep fighting. The third employee, a 19-year-old part-time worker named Michael Torres, had managed to hide in a storage closet and would later testify to the grand jury about what he witnessed through a crack in the door. By 12:15 p.m., the violence had ended as suddenly as it had begun. 18 men stood in the service bay, surrounded by the evidence of what they had done, the reality of their situation slowly penetrating the rage that had consumed them. Willie Preacher Davis was still alive, but fading fast, blood pooling beneath him as Tank Jefferson desperately tried to apply pressure to the chest wound. Big Sam Washington sat against the wall, his hands shaking as he stared at the blood on his clothes, unable to process what had just happened. Tank Jefferson took charge in those crucial minutes, his military training finally cutting through the shock and horror. He sent 3 men to find medical help for Willie Davis, knowing it was probably too late, but unwilling to give up hope. He ordered the others to secure the scene, to make sure Michael Torres was unharmed, to begin the impossible task of figuring out what to do next. The International Harvester sat in the middle of the bay, partially disassembled, the machine they had killed for now seeming insignificant compared to the bodies on the floor. At 12:31 p.m., the first police car arrived at Coleman Brothers Equipment, responding to a 911 call placed by Michael Torres from the storage closet where he had hidden during the violence. Deputy Raymond Kellum stepped out of his patrol car, expecting to find a theft investigation, instead walking into a crime scene that would challenge every assumption he had about the community he served. The sight of 3 bodies and 18 blood-covered men fundamentally changed his understanding of how desperate his neighbors had become. The arrest process took 4 hours and required backup from 3 neighboring counties. Each man was photographed, fingerprinted, and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. though the charges would later be modified based on individual levels of participation. Tank Jefferson insisted on being processed first, taking full responsibility for organizing the search that had led to the confrontation. Big Sam Washington asked if he could call his wife before being transported to the county jail, a request that Deputy Kellum granted out of long-standing friendship and respect. Willie Preacher Davis died in the ambulance at 1:47 p.m., 17 minutes before reaching the regional medical center, making him the fourth fatality of what newspapers would eventually call the March 5th Mississippi Massacre. His death transformed the case from murder to felony murder, adding additional charges and ensuring that all 18 men would face potential death sentences under Mississippi law. The man who had tried to prevent the violence became its final victim, an irony that would haunt the legal proceedings for years to come. News of the arrests spread through the African-American farming community like wildfire, creating divisions that would last for generations. Some families supported the 18 men, arguing that they had been pushed to desperation by systematic economic oppression and had acted in self-defense when confronted with armed resistance. Others condemned the violence, worried that it would bring down harsh retaliation on the entire community and undermine years of careful progress in race relations. The trial began on September 14, 1987, in the Meridian County Courthouse, a building that had witnessed countless injustices during the civil rights era and now faced the challenge of delivering justice in a case where every participant was a victim of larger economic forces. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Harper, portrayed the 18 men as a violent mob that had committed premeditated murder during an armed robbery. The defense, coordinated by a team of lawyers from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, argued that their clients were desperate farmers who had been driven to violence by systematic economic oppression. The testimony lasted 6 weeks and painted a complex picture of rural poverty, equipment theft, and the breakdown of traditional agricultural communities. Michael Torres, the surviving witness, described the violence in graphic detail, but also acknowledged under cross-examination that Coleman and Burke had been armed and had threatened the farmers first. Expert witnesses explained the economics of small-scale farming, the importance of equipment cooperatives, and the devastating impact that the loss of the tractor would have had on nearly 200 families. Tank Jefferson took the stand on October 23rd, his testimony lasting 3 days, as he described the formation of the agricultural collective, the significance of the stolen tractor, and the events that led to the confrontation. He accepted full responsibility for organizing the search and acknowledged that he should have prevented the violence, but he also explained the desperation that had driven 18 otherwise peaceful men to acts they never could have imagined committing. The jury deliberated for 4 days before reaching a verdict that satisfied no one completely but reflected the complex realities of the case. Tank Jefferson was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 12 years in prison. Big Sam Washington and 6 other men who had participated directly in the violence received similar sentences ranging from 8 to 10 years. The remaining 10 men were convicted of lesser charges and received sentences ranging from 2 to 5 years, reflecting their more limited involvement in the actual violence. The aftermath of the March 5th Mississippi Massacre extended far beyond the courtroom, fundamentally changing the agricultural community in Meridian County and serving as a catalyst for broader discussions about rural poverty and economic justice. The Meridian County Agricultural Collective disbanded within 6 months of the trial, its remaining members scattered by legal fees, community division, and the stigma associated with the violence. The International Harvester, the machine that had sparked the entire tragedy, was eventually sold at auction to pay legal expenses. Loretta Washington struggled to maintain the family farm during her husband's incarceration, eventually losing the property to foreclosure in 1991. She moved to Jackson with her 3 children, finding work as a school custodian and raising her family with the quiet dignity that had sustained her through the darkest period of their lives. Big Sam was released in 1994 after serving 7 years of his sentence. But he never returned to farming, instead finding work at an auto parts store where he could use his mechanical skills without the painful associations of agricultural equipment. Tank Jefferson served the full 12 years of his sentence, becoming a leader among the prison population and earning his GED, followed by a bachelor's degree in agricultural business through a correspondence program. Upon his release in 1999, he moved to Memphis and established a non-profit organization that provided equipment-sharing services for small farmers, trying to create the kind of cooperative structure that might have prevented the desperation that led to violence in 1987. Willie Davis's widow, Martha, never remarried and spent the rest of her life advocating for nonviolent conflict resolution in rural communities. She established the Willie Preacher Davis Foundation, which provided mediation services for agricultural disputes and offered interest-free equipment loans to farmers facing economic hardship. Her work touched hundreds of families across the Delta, preventing unknown numbers of conflicts from escalating to violence. The families of Jimmy Coleman and Preston Burke struggled with their own complex grief, mourning their loved ones while also grappling with the economic and social factors that had contributed to their deaths. Coleman's widow eventually sold the equipment dealership and moved to Florida, but Burke's parents remained in the community, quietly supporting criminal justice reform and rural economic development programs that address the root causes of the tragedy. 25 years after the March 5th Mississippi Massacre, the agricultural landscape of Meridian County had been completely transformed by corporate farming operations and technological advancement. The small family farms that had once defined the community were largely gone, replaced by massive industrial operations that employed fewer people and generated less community wealth. The economic forces that had driven 18 desperate men to violence had ultimately achieved their goal of consolidating agricultural production in fewer hands. In 2012, on the 25th anniversary of the massacre, the local newspaper published a retrospective series that included interviews with surviving participants and family members. Tank Jefferson, now 67 years old and running his Memphis nonprofit, reflected that the tragedy had been both preventable and inevitable, the result of economic pressures that had been building for generations. He expressed deep regret for the violence, but maintained that the underlying issues of agricultural equity and rural poverty remained unaddressed. Big Sam Washington, interviewed at his home in Jackson where he lived with his wife Loretta and helped care for his grandchildren, spoke quietly about the man he had been before March 5th, 1987, and the man he became afterward. He described the weight of carrying the memory of that violence, the way it had changed his relationship with himself and his community, but also the growth that had come from confronting the consequences of his actions and working to become someone his grandchildren could respect. The story of the March 5th Mississippi Massacre serves as a cautionary tale about the intersection of economic desperation and social justice, illustrating how systematic inequality can push ordinary people beyond their moral boundaries and create tragedies that echo through generations. The 18 men who gathered in that service bay were not criminals in any traditional sense, but rather the products of an economic system that had gradually stripped away their dignity, their hope, and finally their ability to respond to crisis with anything other than violence. Today, the Coleman Brothers equipment building stands empty, its windows boarded and its parking lot cracked with weeds growing through the asphalt. A small memorial plaque near the entrance remembers the 4 men who died there, but it offers no easy answers about how such a tragedy might be prevented in the future. The building serves as a monument to the complex realities of rural American life, where economic forces beyond individual control can transform neighbors into enemies and peaceful communities into scenes of unimaginable violence. The legacy of March 5, 1987 continues to influence discussions about agricultural policy, criminal justice reform, and economic inequality in rural America. The case has been studied by sociologists, criminologists, and economists as an example of how structural violence can manifest as interpersonal violence when communities reach their breaking point. It reminds us that behind every crime statistic are human stories of desperate choices made by ordinary people facing impossible circumstances. The International Harvester tractor that started it all was eventually purchased by a corporate farm in Arkansas, where it operated for another 15 years before being retired and sold for scrap metal. The machine that represented hope and economic survival for nearly 200 families ended its life as recycled steel, a fitting metaphor for the way economic forces can transform human dreams into industrial commodities. As we reflect on the events of that humid March morning 36 years ago, we are left with uncomfortable questions about justice, poverty, and the price of economic progress. The March 5th Mississippi Massacre stands as a reminder that behind every headline about rural crime or agricultural consolidation are real families whose lives have been forever changed by forces largely beyond their control. Their story challenges us to consider what we might do differently to address the root causes of desperation before they manifest as tragedy, and to remember that true justice must address not only the consequences of violence, but also the conditions that make such violence seem like the only available option. The morning of March 5, 1987, began like any other day in the Mississippi Delta, with hard-working families preparing to tend the land that had sustained them for generations. By sunset, 4 men were dead, 18 families were shattered, and an entire community had learned that desperation and violence can transform the most ordinary places into scenes of unimaginable tragedy. The lesson of that day continues to echo through the years, a reminder that justice without economic opportunity is merely the management of desperation, and that the true measure of a community's strength is not its ability to punish violence after it occurs, but its commitment to addressing the conditions that make such violence seem inevitable.